Okay, welcome back. So this is day two, part four, the final part and final lecture, mini lecture on psychedelics. And so I'm going to talk today about another strange psychedelic. I call it strange just like I called ketamine and PCP strange, in that it acts on a very different receptor system in the brain relative to the classic serotonin-driven based psychedelics. All right, let's go on. So let's review here all the different categories of psychedelics we've talked about. We talked about sacred datura and scopolamine in the anticholinergic category. We talked about the catecholamine-like drugs like mescaline and MDMA. We talked about the serotonin-like drugs like psilocybin from magic mushrooms, DMT, ayahuasca, and LSD. And then we talked about glutamatergic based drugs that actually block NMDA glutamate receptors, like ketamine and PCP. And today we'll talk about this drug called salvinorin A from the salvia plant that is actually operating on the opioid system, but a different opioid system than the one we might associate with heroin. It's the kappa opioid system. So a different class altogether than the other four. All right, kappa opioid psychedelics. The main one we know about is salvinorin A. At least that's the main one I know about. And it comes from the leaves of this plant that's in Mexico. It can be grown in most places. It's just called Salvia divinorum. It's from the mint family. So the salvia family is a very common type of plant, but the divinorum strain is the one that the leaves contain the salvinorin A. And it's been used for curing and divination by the Mazatec people in Oaxaca, Mexico for many, many, many centuries. So it's definitely had its application in communities for many hundreds of years. So it's no mystery to many people. All right. So in the 60s, though, it's more introduced into the West by Gordon Wasson. So he's the psilocybin guy we talked about earlier. The guy popularized it with his Life magazine article back in the 50s, I think. And then interestingly, so Wasson and then Anita Hoffman, that's the wife of Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD and the person who figured out the active component in psilocybin. So Albert Hoffman, they all got together and tried it. So I guess they were friends. And Anita had more hallucinogenic experiences with it, brightly bordered images, striking, where, let's see, Hoffman, but again, the Bicycle Day discoverer LSD said it put him in a state of mental sensitivity and intense experience, but absolutely no hallucinations. So it has, I guess, different effects on different people. But it was just an interesting historic anecdote from some of the luminaries in the psychedelic world. All right, what does it make you feel like? Okay, we had two case reports there, but in general, it seems to produce some of the very florid hallucinations you see in some of the classic LSD, psilocybin, psychedelics. But they're a little more different in that they're often not pleasant. So many psychedelic experiences, the users will report that the experience was somewhat pleasant, although as we've talked about with things like LSD, sometimes you can have a bad trip, and about 10 to 15% of reported experiences. But in this case, those bad trips are more common with salvinorin A. So you get this more or less an unpleasant, not necessarily terrifying, but just a generally unpleasant experience, but still might be profound and that meaningful to the person having it. People report things like becoming objects. Some interesting reports from some of the self-reports is that they became yellow-plaid French fries, fresh paint. I guess you can become fresh paint. A drawer, a pant leg, a Ferris wheel. So yes, you can feel that you become objects. This is kind of like ayahuasca, but people often report experiencing other beings and creatures, so that they're there. That's what the picture on the right seems to tell me is that they're getting a sense. You find all sorts of fun things when you Google images for salvinorin A or LSD. It's always fun to look at the Google images that come up. But anyway, you get this experience of other beings and creatures. You might get this somatosensory kind of feel, like spinning like a top. People often report losing a sense of time. That's often, or at least distortions of time. That's, by the way, common with ayahuasca as well, and DMT especially. And it's shorter lasting. So if you remember, like LSD or even mescaline can last for many, many hours. This is different. Salvinorin A, the experience tends to last only 5 to 30 minutes. All right, how does it work? Salvinorin A. It's one of the less researched chemicals, although it's interesting that it's less researched because it's actually not a Schedule I drug. It's relatively, for scientifically, easy to access. So not much known, but what we do know is it does work. Salvinorin A does work on the kappa opioid receptor. So I don't know how much I've talked about it, but for addiction and the pain-reducing effects of opioids like fentanyl and heroin or morphine, those act primarily on the mu, or the Greek letter mu, opioid receptor. And so that's associated with pleasure, euphoria, pain reduction. The kappa opioid receptor can also reduce pain, but it's definitely not associated with euphoria. In fact, people can report a more general sense of dysphoria, like not feeling good, unease, even though their pain is still reduced. And so kappa opioid receptors are really interesting because they may allow for pain reduction and not have the euphoric and potentially addiction-inducing effects that classic opioids like morphine, heroin, fentanyl can produce. Okay, so there's also some evidence that it is really interesting that activating those kappa opioid receptors might help reduce addiction. And so that's a new line of research for the therapeutic application. All right. Interestingly, even though you can get these very rich hallucinations with salvinorin A and the Salvia divinorum plant, this drug, salvinorin A, apparently does not have any effect on any serotonin receptor. And that's kind of surprising, as almost every other drug, psychedelic drug, at least has some sort of effect on those receptors, although the glutamatergic NMDA ones like ketamine and PCP might also not activate on those serotonin receptors. But anyway, it's mysterious how it can produce the psychedelic effects and the hallucinations without working on the serotonin receptor system. The answer might be, however, in an area of the brain called the claustrum. It's this interesting thin brain region kind of hugging the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, if you remember, is an area important for motor control, for reward-driven learning, for addiction. It's kind of in the middle of the brain, kind of covered by the cortex. The claustrum is this thin, multi-layered region of the brain. It has different layers and different cell types. It's different, very different from the cortex, very different from the basal ganglia. It's its own unique thing. And it seems to be very critical for attention and awareness. And for example, if you put your electrode in the claustrum and give it super high stimulation, like say 140 times a second, you stimulate the area. It's interesting that a very high frequency electrical stimulation like that kind of overwhelms the neurons or the axons in that particular area of the brain and effectively shuts off that part of the brain. So let me just say that if you shut off the claustrum, you generally induce a state of anesthesia or unresponsiveness where people just can't do anything. They lose all volitional behavior and they don't remember anything either. All right, and so that's one clue as to what the claustrum does, but it seems to be active more when you're attending to something, when you're very aware of something. And generally, we think it's like this central kind of conductor that helps conduct information from, let's say, the cortex to other brain regions or from other brain regions to the cortex. And so it's like this conductor to help organized communication with brain regions, and if you take out the conductor, you've effectively shut off awareness. All right, so why the claustrum? Well, because the claustrum is pretty unique in that there's a super, super high density of these kappa opioid receptors in the claustrum, and that suggests that the salvinorin A may turn off this brain region and therefore turn off, quote, conscious awareness or self-awareness. All right, I'll end with some of the possible therapeutic uses of salvinorin A, which again is not Schedule 1, so it's not hard to access, although this is definitely under review. But there's some investigations as to whether this drug might be useful for chronic pain. There's more evidence, I would say, in that it may be useful for treating addiction. There's some work in it treating gastrointestinal disorders. And a benefit of this drug relative to many of the other psychedelics, generally the most psychedelics don't have too much of an addiction risk, but there's a very, very, very low addiction risk with salvinorin A, mostly probably because it's making you not feel great, or at least the psychedelic experiences may be profound, but somewhat unpleasant. And so it's a non-addictive drug, and so that might be good in that you can give it as a treatment and not worry that your patient is going to become a junkie. All right, well, that ends our psychedelics lecture, so I will see you in a day, and we'll enter the world of marijuana, THC, and CBD.